Hello, and welcome to Don't Let Behavior Get Under Your Skin, Responding to Behavior for Beginners. I'm Jen Oswald, and I'm glad to be here today at the Paraeducator Conference. Thank you for joining me. As I said, my name is Jen Oswald, and I am a tax staff developer at the Lincoln Intermediate Unit 12 in New Oxford, and we service York, Franklin, and Adams counties. Today in our workshop, we're going to just talk about how student behavior can become pretty easy to take personally. In this beginner session, we're going to learn about responding to behavior matrix. We're going to look at the 4 areas of the matrix: prevention, escalation, crisis, and repairing the harm. And we're going to talk about identifying features of a student's behavior that helps us to know what phase they're in and how we can support them in that phase. Our outcome today will be to classify characteristics on the behavior continuum as either prevention, escalation, crisis, or recovery. All behavior is a form of communication. When students' behavior begins to escalate, this is definitely communication of increasing distress. Sometimes that communication to us is something we can manage and we can support students with. And sometimes we can't. Their needs have to be met in another way, and we aren't able to offer what they need. But we need to definitely work hard to try and figure out what the underlying distress is when students' behavior begins to escalate. If you take a moment, read this quote. Pause the video for a moment and think about what this quote means to you. Hi, and welcome back. I hope you had a chance to process this quote and think about it. Some people will read this quote and think, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The behavior is not about me. They're not doing this to me. They're not getting up in the morning trying to think of all the ways they can aggravate me today. But rather, it's a symptom of something else that's wounded and going deeper in their life. Some people will look at this and say, nope, I take it personally. Today, I'm hoping that you'll be able to look at this quote at the end of this session and feel a sense of knowing that truly the only behavior that we can control is our own. So when we think of challenging behavior, we think of behavior errors. Sometimes those behavior errors can happen because students don't know the appropriate skill. For example, we might say to them that we want to decrease impulsivity, and they really don't understand what impulsivity is. They don't realize that poking their neighbor or grabbing something off of someone's desk or not raising their hand and calling out is considered impulsivity. So sometimes we need to actually teach the direct and appropriate skill. Sometimes students understand the skill, but they struggle with the application of it. So I understand that I'm supposed to raise my hand, but I forget and I call out. And my metacognitive strategies of being able to reflect on my own thinking, I don't really catch myself calling out until someone else points it out to me. Sometimes students have never really been explicitly taught the lesson. We expect when they get to a certain grade level that they might understand and they should know exactly what's expected in the bathroom. And maybe we weren't as explicit as what we could have been in explaining to students how to navigate situations like maybe walking in on someone vaping in the bathroom, or how to handle a situation where someone has run out of toilet paper in the bathroom. Sometimes those specific skills are a deficit because we've never explicitly taught them. Or sometimes we teach them, but we don't teach them in the context or environment that the students are going to be using them. For example, we might teach students what's expected at an assembly, but we don't do it actually down in the auditorium or down in the gymnasium when we teach it. We teach it in the classroom, and students aren't able to really be sitting in the environment and absorb what's around them. And so sometimes we just need to change the environment of where it's taught in order for it to register for students. As we consider this quote, if a child doesn't know how to read, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to swim, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to multiply, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to yet to drive a car, we teach and train them. If a child doesn't know how to behave, we teach or we punish. Sometimes it's hard to finish that sentence because the behaviors feel so personal. It feels like when a student is doing something they shouldn't be, that it's just directly pointed at us to try and get under our skin or try and get under a students around them, a classmate's skin. And so when we think about this notion of behavior, we want to make sure that we are teaching. And yes, there are consequences that come from our actions and our behaviors. Absolutely. And those consequences should be as natural and organically connected to the behavior as possible. However, we also want to make sure that we aren't taking it so personal that we forget to teach. Today, we're going to take a look at the de-escalation matrix. This matrix is divided into 4 areas. The 4 areas that it's divided into are prevention, escalation, crisis, and recovery and restoration. We're going to walk through each of these 4 phases. So at the end of this session, you should be able to take a look at student behaviors and decide, does it fit into which of these categories and what strategies could I potentially do to help the student navigate when they're escalated. So the first section we're going to take a look at is prevention. In prevention, we see students in a calm, regulated space where we are actively supervising, we are encouraging students' appropriate behaviors, and we are making sure that our activity or lesson has lots of opportunities for engagement and opportunities to respond. So this is where we're at in the challenging phases behavior. When we think about this notion of direct or explicit instruction, we find from John Hattie's research that anything over 0.4 has about a year's worth of growth attributed to it. And in this case, the effect size of direct instruction is 0.59, which is well over a year's worth of growth, and puts us into that zone of desired effect. Direct instruction has its place as well as discovery learning. So in discovery learning, we might know that students already have foundational knowledge, and we're looking to have them just discover and apply and be curious and question things, maybe science labs or experiments. However, if students didn't already have that foundational safety knowledge about that lab or science experiment, we might run into some issues with trying to do a lab under the notion of discovery and curiosity. It could be, quite frankly, downright dangerous and not safe. So we have explicit instruction that's also a part of that piece of that arrow. And explicit instruction is the opposite end of students taking on that discovery or curious learning. It's where the teacher is really teaching very explicitly expectations, foundational knowledge, safety. So when we think about behavior, it really does kind of fall into that explicit interaction where we are giving instruction exactly what we expect and need from the students. Could be around safety, it could be around behavior. And what does that look like in terms of in the cafeteria, in the auditorium, in the classroom, the hallways, and the bus? So when we think about teaching class expectations, rules, and routines, we think about making sure we're following this procedure. 1, we're stating what the rule is. The rule is be safe. Discuss the importance of it. Safety is important for all students, for yourself, and for the adults in the room. Model examples in context or location. So back to that notion of, are we teaching in context and making sure that we're teaching in the cafeteria what the cafeteria expectations are. And then providing opportunities for practice and feedback. We want to make sure we acknowledge when students are doing it the correct way. Nice job putting your tray back where it belongs and stacking it in the right direction. Thanks for being respectful and responsible. And then discussing any consequences that we might have. If we don't stack them the appropriate way, the trays are going to fall over and be a safety issue for others. We want to make sure we schedule time to teach, and this really should happen ideally in the first several weeks of school. We want to make sure that sooner than later, because honestly, we can't in good conscience provide consequences and punishment to students if we haven't explicitly taught what we expect of them. It truly is unethical to do that. We want to make sure that we're also reinforcing those expectations after a break or vacation or environmental changes. Think about it at the beginning of the year with all the new things that are happening, and also at the end of the year when we think about assemblies and field trips and awards banquets and things that are in new environments. We want to make sure our students truly understand what is expected. And while we know that students know bus rules and maybe ride the bus every single day, but when they go on a field trip, they're with a brand new bus driver on a different bus, different seat configuration, shapes, sizes, colors, and we have all new students potentially, not the neighborhood kids that they rode the bus with every year. And so we want to make sure that students are still showing those same expectations on the bus that we expect of them every day to and from school, also on that field trip. We have to take time to explicitly teach that. All right, when we think about opportunities to respond, we want to make sure that students truly have the ability to share from their perspective, to answer questions. Maybe we have kids do a choral read or simultaneously respond, or maybe we have them put it on Post-it notes or on a whiteboard. But we want to make sure that we prompt the students to respond in some capacity to keep their engagement throughout those lessons. So we're not just talking to them about the rules, but actually asking them to share their own experience and to be able to make this long-term learning for them. When we think about prevention, one of the most important things we can do is build relationships. And I know we hear that so often and we think, yeah, I build relationships, I do that. But when we think about this notion of students who are having a difficult time in our classes or small group instruction or one-on-one, we want to make sure that kids really feel comfortable each day with us as they're coming to school. So showing interest in things that they like, paying attention, noticing when maybe they're fidgety or need a break, making sure that we talk with them about what's new in their lives and what's important. It can take literally just 10 seconds each time we connect with a student before we start into the cognitive activity. But that connection before content is so important in building that relationship. The next area of the de-escalation matrix that we're going to look at is when students begin to escalate. In this setting, we notice that students tend to be maybe either off task or they might appear angry or anxious. They might be breathing heavy or a little bit frustrated or withdrawn. We might see a sign of this in students as they come back off the playground after lunch or maybe back from some activity that was very competitive, maybe having a lot of feels. Behaviors may increase and behaviors may decrease. And what we mean by that is sometimes we'll see an increase in attitude or an increase in frustration. We might see a decrease in work effort and work completion. We might see a student accelerate pretty quickly in this phase. It might start off with a little bit of irritation or agitation, and then it might quickly move into a behavior that has really boom, exploded. And it kind of feels like, whoa, where did that come from? But we don't often know what students are coming in with at the beginning of the day or what they might be going home stressed about. And so those behaviors can kind of quickly and intensely prevail. And it seems like it's out of nowhere, but that student may be already dealing with something that's very stressful in their life. And this just kind of exacerbates quickly. So as we think about how we respond to students in this area of escalation, we think about some basic responses like physical proximity, direct eye contact, maybe a signal or a nonverbal cue, reminding the students what we need them to do. And so when we think about this in kind of layman's terms, it was often referred to me as the hairy eyeball look. You know, when mom looked at me and kind of gave me that look like, don't you even think about it. It might be just moving close to the student and letting them know that you're present, you're noticing them without even having to say a word. It could be a nonverbal, just as a reminder to a student, as a sample of the student I talked about with impulsivity. Maybe it's just a quick pull of my left earring lets him know or her know that they're showing signs of impulsivity, calling out, etc., without having to give a verbal redirect so that I don't escalate the situation further. Whoops, hang on one second. We also might see where we need to specifically interact with the student. So beyond the nonverbal, moving specifically into praising a behavior that we notice that's correct. It might be that we are reinforcing the student exactly when they have finished doing what they needed to do. And then we might kind of let up on that and come back and revisit it later. So it's not every single time, but maybe every other time we're praising them. We also might need to give really specific redirection or specific error correction. So I might might say something to a student that I notice they're being unsafe, and I want to redirect them very quickly to move away from something hot. Maybe there's a Bunsen burner going and their hair is close to it. And I say, don't back up, move forward, and let them know directly what they need to do. Oops, sorry about that. I may have to, because the student is escalating so much, I may have to move into the regulate, relate, and reason procedure, which means I may have to help a student really kind of get back into their cognitive thinking brain. I may have to get them to do some breathing or go for a short walk or get a drink of water just to kind of help re-regulate their brain and then relate to them. Hey, I noticed you're having a hard time today. Did you want to talk about it? Of course, I'm not going to have that talk conversation before they're regulated. And then reasoning with them. I know this is hard for you right now. Excuse me, maybe you want to do this a little later on after you've had lunch and recess break. So just having that regulate, relate, and reason conversation with students. Hang on one second here. There we go. When we think about safety, trauma really does disrupt safety. And so when we think about safety, we often think about what is currently present and around us, and it makes us maybe feel unsafe in the moment. But safety can actually be a feel that students have from a traumatic experience. And maybe there is absolutely nothing in the environment that's necessarily triggering them to feel unsafe, but there's a memory. And we know in trauma typically doesn't come back as a memory, but it comes back as a reaction. So students will often react in a way as though they're in an unsafe situation, even though truly there's not a safety threat in the environment currently. And when students react and come back, that trauma comes back as a response and not as a memory. We want to make sure that students really have the chance to just kind of recognize, and we may have to provide some co-regulation to help them come back into a healthy learning space. And we'll talk about co-regulation a little later on. When we think about neuroscience and the research that comes out of some of the functional MRIs that have been done, what we notice about students is that students and actually adults, all human beings, function hopefully academically in the prefrontal cortex of their brain. So they have their cognitive thinking brain on most of the time. However, when there is a sense of fight, flight, or freeze, or there's a sense of not being safe, when students get into that space, they're actually in the amygdala part of their brain, where they're not really thinking with that prefrontal cortex, and they're not thinking rationally, but rather responding, again, coming back as a reaction or a response rather than as a memory. And in these two videos, Dan Siegel's video is more for secondary, and the other one is really more for elementary with the lady. But they really talk about how the brain functions, and they use an example of the brain being like this. And when that brain flips its lid, right, it's now functioning in the amygdala, and it's not functioning any longer in the prefrontal cortex. So they talk about when we're in the academic phase, we're really functioning in that prefrontal cortex. And when we flip our lid and we feel that fight, flight, or freeze, we're functioning in our amygdala. And so helping students to co-regulate and come back to that prefrontal cortex. Those videos are available if you're interested in them. In regulation, we think about it's the ability really to manage and control our own behavior with positive and negative emotions. And it takes 1,000 experimental moments of being co-regulated to develop the executive function of emotional regulation. So when we think about our students, they really haven't had that opportunity to really do that. And so they really do have to lean into us to help them to be able to regulate themselves. They need to lean into us. We need to learn to them what it takes to be in a healthy space. So when we think about self-regulation or regulation skills, we really want to kind of change our mindset to more so talking about this notion of co-regulation when we're talking about students. And it really does kind of lend to this graphic of when they're in a storm and their storm meets our calm, co-regulation can occur. So when we think about co-regulation, it's not really about us fixing the child's behavior. It's about really just kind of sitting in the muck with them and helping them feel through it and helping them return to calm. It's a way of being and not just a strategy. So when we think about how we can help students who are struggling, the best way that we can help them is to stay calm ourselves. And that's where it's really hard, because it's really easy to jump into letting it get under our skin and get us escalated ourselves. So just stopping, dropping our shoulders, taking a belly breath, and just kind of making sure we're regulated ourselves so that we can kind of help co-regulate a child. We can't punish calm into them, but we can model calm for them. It's lending our calm, not matching their chaos. Let me say that again. It is lending our calm, not matching their chaos. And regulation is taught through connection rather than correction. When students feel safe with us, then they know they can trust us and we can help co-regulate them. Crisis is the third phase of the de-escalation matrix, and this is the most dangerous and unpredictable phase. It happens and can happen actually very quickly. We can see kids go from very agitated and irritated, or mildly irritated and agitated, all the way to crisis and full explosion and dangerous. Sometimes we can see it coming. Sometimes we can prevent it from sort of spilling over into crisis through using some of those de-escalation strategies that we talked about. When a student is in this phase, they're typically not in control of their body or emotions. We hear things from them that can be taken very personal. You're a jerk. I hate you. Profanity could be used. Students get into that fight, flight, or freeze mode, and they typically are not compliant rather with any requests that we have. So when we think about our nervous system, we have to name it to tame it. Dan Siegel is who we talked about with that notion of the neuroscience and how we function in the amygdala when we're in fight, flight, or freeze. And so we want to make sure our consequences in school are relationally safe. So when we have a student who causes harm to us, making sure that we take the time when both the adult and student are regulated to talk about what happened and how it impacted each other. It's really important to recognize that, because that's how we create a relationally safe environment. And so what we think about is my nervous system strong enough to hold for both of us in these next few minutes what is needed, because the amygdala is that fire alarm and our kids come with relational poverty. So the more we can relate to students and get them relating to us and others, the more we can help them to truly co-regulate and truly make sure that we have honest conversations when both parties are regulated to talk about how we can repair the harm. And we'll talk about that next. So when we think about what we can control, it really is just our behavior that we can control. We can't control a student's behavior. We can kind of help provide some supports to them, but we have to remember that the only person that we can control in a crisis is ourselves. And so we need to make sure that we ourselves are kind of remaining calm and regulated. There are a few strategies here, the focused attention practices of tap it out. I am okay. I am okay, right? Just saying something to yourself that kind of helps you repeat and feel safe in your environment. Box breathing, in 2, 3, 4, hold 2, 3, 4, out 2, 3, 4, hold 2, 3, 4. That box breathing can help us just to kind of get ourselves regulated. Getting grounded, looking at 5 things around you that you see, 4 you feel, 3 that you hear, 2 that you smell, 1 that you taste. I have to say, in this crisis de-escalation matrix portion, the most important strategy is the why am I talking strategy, the wait strategy. If you remember nothing else from the crisis de-escalation portion, remember wait, W-A-I-T. Why am I talking? Often when a student is dysregulated, we feel like if we could just say the right thing or do the right thing, we could help the student to come out of that space. And that focus is really on us fixing them. And that's really not what it's all about. It's us being calm and our calm energy playing a part in the students' recovery and co-regulation. So when we think about what we can do when a student is really stressed out and in that crisis space, they're no longer in escalation where we can kind of help turn it around, but they have completely come to a place of unraveling. We want to make sure that our energy is stable as the student is unstable or highly agitated. We want to make sure there's really not much talking or touch or even direct eye contact. And it might include having to remove other students from the environment, or if the student is safe to be able to be removed from a stimulating environment, we can move the student. But oftentimes in crisis, we have to kind of remove other folks to make sure they remain safe and the student has plenty of room in their situation that they're in. It really is this notion of an active waiting where you're just kind of giving space and place and calm to their storm. So if we think about strategies of the wait strategy, as I said, using those tap it out breathing strategies to calm ourselves and give ourselves the chance to be in control of our own behavior then can help us with helping a student who's dysregulated. Sometimes teachers have to implement, and certainly as a para, you would want to be aware if the student does have a crisis support plan or routine. But we want to think about what is a phrase that's going to be my go-to for regulating a child. What is my response to helping to relate to the child? And what is my simple instruction? When a student can respond to a simple instruction, it's an indication that they are starting to regulate. And so obviously none of that can be done when students really just are in that crisis full blown. But as they start to come down out of it, we might say things like, let's breathe. Can you blow this cotton ball through the straw? Blow the air through the straw and blow the cotton ball across the desk. Can you match my breathing? Just some simple things to help them with their breathing and relaxation. Because the way we get them out of the amygdala is through the brainstem, which monitors heart rate and breathing. We get them being aware of their surroundings, and then we can start to relate to them. I know this was really hard for you. Why don't you come with me? And so that's simple instruction. Here are some strategies that we might use when we are looking at students who are in that crisis phase. Again, we might have to have a crisis teaching procedure in place. where we know exactly how we're going to respond to that student, and we know exactly what we're going to do. And if we have a student who escalates often, we want to have that teaching procedure with them ahead of time before they're in an escalated state. And then we have to go back and regulate, relate, and reason. So hopefully regulate, relate, and reason can be enough in the escalation phase before they even peak to crisis. But if they do, then we have to put that crisis teaching procedure in place and then go through that regulate, relate, and reason. And that order is extremely important. We have to regulate the brain first before we can get back to the cognitive thinking to relate and reason with them. Our last section of the behavior matrix is the restoration and repair. So if a student is not regulated, they won't be able to relate, they won't be able to reason. We can't start having conversations to repair the harm if a student is not fully regulated. Once they are fully regulated, we want to make sure that we can identify what triggered. We want to know what strategies are most helpful to the student so that we can be ready the next time. And we want to make sure that we ourselves are calm as well as the student to be able to have the conversation with them. During this phase, we might use affective questioning. We might have some conferencing with the student where we say where the harm happened and how it affected us, as well as what you noticed about how it affected them. They have the opportunity to share as well how it affected them and maybe even offer up their apologies for their behavior and seeing how it affected you or other students in the small group. When we think about the difference between punishment and consequence, we think about this notion of punishment. Punishment makes the doer uncomfortable enough to want to change the behavior. So if I get a speeding ticket and I have a nasty fine that I have to pay and it hits my wallet hard, I'm probably not going to speed in that particular area that I got caught, but probably won't change my speeding altogether. When we think about consequence, it is a result or effect of an action or condition. Ideally, it puts the responsibility on the offender to take responsibility for their behavior. So when we think about punishment, kind of making it so uncomfortable that people don't want to do it again versus a consequence, which is, look, I screwed up or I affected others and I need to have a conversation to repair that. We can have repairs and reintegration that happen either concretely or symbolically. Concretely is how we can repair what was damaged. So maybe we damaged a wall, maybe we damaged a desk. We took everything on a desk and dumped it on the floor, cleaning it up. It might be a symbolic repair where we think about how we can make things right, offer an apology, think about how the other person felt, etc. And again, none of this can happen unless the students and the adults are regulated. We might talk about what happened, what harm resulted, what we need to make things right, how we felt, how we were impacted. When we think about punishment, that does not necessarily create empathy for the situation, and it doesn't separate the deed from the doer. Consequence does do those things. So let's wrap up. There are a few scenarios that I'm going to share with you, and I want you to think about whether this behavior is kind of showing this notion of prevention, escalation, crisis, or repairing of the harm. So the first scenario is the teacher shares a parent survey with you regarding the students who you work with. So knowing that information ahead of time, is that prevention? Is that escalation? Is that crisis or repairing of the harm? I'm just going to ask you to either make a note or stop the video and share with a partner if you're watching this with a colleague. All right, if you said prevention, you are correct. This is really this notion of getting to know the students and building relationships with them and making sure that they know we care about them and the things that they care about. And that's really in the prevention stage. Another example, the teacher pair or student have a conference about the student. The student is regulated and they discuss what happened and the impact on each person. Go ahead and decide which of the four phases. If you said repairing the harm, you are correct. The para decides to use a planned ignoring strategy for tapping that the student is doing. And instead, the student is given a fidget. So we ignore the behavior of the tapping, we give them a fidget. You could say prevention, or you could say escalation. We're starting to see that child mildly escalated, and so we're kind of heading it off at the pass by using planned ignoring. And then maybe preventatively, we are going to give them a fidget so that it does not escalate further. The next scenario is the student begins to toss items on a desk and then moves towards a table to do the same. The para asks the other students to move to the front of the classroom and remain safe and move away from the situation, because we don't know if any of those items could hurt potentially someone. And so the student is starting to move in out of escalation into crisis when we start tossing things around and becoming dangerous. Now, if the student is just tossing a piece of paper on the floor, we probably would classify it as escalation. But if the student truly is tossing a desk and things and someone could get hurt, we're moving more into that crisis because of the dangerousness. A student begins to say inappropriate things in front of a small group that you're working with. You ask the student who is acting physically safe, but inappropriately speaking, to go for a walk and get a drink at the water fountain. What phase is this in? And if you said escalation, you are correct. So as we think about our outcome for today, and we think about what we needed to accomplish in this training, we really wanted to have a better understanding of the different phases of the de-escalation matrix and making sure that students truly get the supports that they need. And so by us recognizing these phases of the de-escalation matrix, it kind of helps take that personal under our skin feel out of it and helps to remind us that these are normal processes that kids go through as far as prevention and escalation and repairing the harm. We hope students don't get into crisis often, but when they do, that we have some supports in place for them. So again, this session was about really understanding the 4 phases. In the advanced session, we are going to take this knowledge and we are going to apply it with some scenarios where you're going to unpack what it is you might do and what phase the student is in based on those scenarios. Thanks for joining me today. I'm so glad to have been with you here for this beginner session of Don't Let Behavior Get Under Your Skin. I hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful school year. Take care now.